Thank you. I want to thank Buddy Burke so much for bringing me along to be able to be with all of you here today. This is a real treat. And so thank you to all those in Lafayette, California and across the globe. I think as a child of Rotaries and a grandchild of Rotaries, I've seen what you do in action, and it is very, very important for the truth, the integrity of what happens in our world today, and especially even just this morning, getting to see your opening um, meeting procedures. It really reinforces the importance of community. Community is where we find our support, our comfort, and our success, our creativity, all of these things and so many more. And so I have a charge for all of you Rotaries out there, and that you have homework at the end of this, and I'll get to that later, but to dive into that concept of community at the broadest scale, the community of life as a whole. And perhaps there's no more important time in history than right now for us to be a part of that community so that we bring all of our human companions along, but all of the rest of life so that we all can persist and flourish in the ways that we'd like to see happen. So, eavesdropping on wild conversations is really about how we can re-enter these conversations and that community of life as a whole on planet Earth. It's been a while since we really depended on Mother Nature and her direct products to sustain our life, our inspiration, spiritual support. It's become much more of a world of what we do as humans that we lean to in times of challenge and success. And so what I want to do here is we make this attempt to dive back into the community of nature is give you some ideas of how to do that. So you have your own personal experience with the truth that is nature and what she can do to inspire us going forward. So whether it's with kids, whether it's with neighbors, with friends, fellow Rotaries, or just on your own, hopefully this will help. Whether it's that frog in the pond, in the neighborhood park, whether that's the deer in your backyard or the birds that come to your feeder, they all have messages that are actually really fascinating and really important to us. And one of the best ways for us to tap into these conversations is one of our lesser used senses, our ears, to listen. And so what I'm going to do in lieu of being able to bring all of you right now into Yellowstone, which I'm looking out the window and we've got a light snow falling and the sagebrush is getting dusted. We've got a few inches on the ground, but there's life out there. And so I'm going to take you on a little bit of an audio tour of dawn as it may have sounded here in Yellowstone. So if you've been to Yellowstone, picture one of your favorite spots there. Maybe it's early in the morning. Close your eyes. And for each of you now, I ask you to close your eyes and put yourself, if not in Yellowstone, in some special, quiet, wild place that you know. It's dawn, and so before you can see very well, you have to listen. And what you hear might sound something like this. And perhaps by that point, the sun is up. You can hear and see, And if you didn't know the species that those sounds were attributed to, elk, gray wolves, coyotes, American robin, osprey, great horned owl, doesn't matter. The point is you each have a dawn chorus, a soundscape outside of that of mankind that is just billowing with not only information, but insights that help you find your way in your everyday. And so as we dive into these conversations, it's a natural question of where do you even start? And the important concept here is that you listen to everyone. Everyone, whether they're a non-native species, a native species, a really abundant one that's all over the golf course that you'd rather see gone, they each have something to share. Not only telling you the perspective of their point of view in the world, and keep in mind, a lot of these creatures and the importance of listening to them is they see the world in ways we never, ever will. Some of these creatures are seeing the world in ultraviolet bandwidths of vision. They can hear in ultrasonic frequencies above 20, 30,000 hertz. We can't even hear, or even subsonic sounds, deep, low rumbling like an African elephant or an American bison. So listening to all of them is important, but how the heck do you go about doing that, right? You hear this crow sitting, or raven sitting up on a telephone pole, and ha, 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 or and it's just noise, right? At a certain point, it's just mixing in with the trash collector, the traffic on the highway. It's just more noise. But in reality, that dawn chorus, that bird on the wire, is using communication. It's saying something to someone. And as we learn to tap into that, we can know some bits, not all, of course, but we can make great strides to understand more of what they're saying that really advances our own appreciation for our surroundings, gives tons of joy, but also some feedback on what's happening in that environment. So around us, and this is what I'd suggest for all of my students here in Yellowstone and abroad, is start with those creatures that are most common and closest to you. That means it could be a pigeon. It could be a house sparrow. Those things, they're just in the way. But in reality, they're messengers. For us, it's the common raven. And the most common vocalizations and gestures that you see them doing, those are the most useful point to start. So for ravens, that's a 3-note call. Almost on a loop. When we first moved to Yellowstone country, this bird was always there and it was always saying that. Now the beauty and the real magic is when the most common animals saying the most common things change it up. So for instance, one day I was out watching these ravens, and from another direction I heard one say not, which is their song. That 3-note is basically their territorial call. This one said, and it sounds different, doesn't it? Right? Well, I looked, and that raven had a full mouth. Now, in Yellowstone, if you find a raven flying with a crab, you need to report that, because that is not at all expected. The one I was watching actually had a piece of meat in its mouth. And what it did was take off, it landed, hid that piece of meat, and then went back to the source for more. Instantly, I know where there's a new carcass brought down by gray wolves. Something as simple as that change up of an animal talking with its mouth full, which unlike probably your parents, like mine, you don't talk with your mouth full. It doesn't apply to these birds, and it's useful. So the variations continue, and this is where the beauty is, as seeing and listening to how they shift. And there's one particular call that if a friend here shows up and says, "Hey George, we just found a new bison that was injured in the rut, in the breeding season, it got killed. It's out there, and there's probably going to be bears on it. There's probably going to be wolves showing up." I go out to a likely spot in the vicinity, in that valley, and I close my eyes. And what I listen for is another variation. And that variation sounds like this. Ha! Ha! Now, if you're near a nest in the summer, any of you who've had a nest of crows or jays or anything like that near your house in spring know they can drive you bananas, right? If you hear that, At that time of year, that's a begging chick. Bring me food. Mom, 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 mom. And it goes on and on and on. But at other times of year, when it's being made by adult birds, that sound means one thing and one thing only: meat. Not any kind of food, but meat. So when I go out and I listen in that part of the valley for the location of something I haven't yet found, I listen for ah! Because it only means one thing. I close my eyes, keep my eyes closed perhaps, and point, because we sometimes bias where we think sounds come from by where we see and what we see. So I'll kind of point. And I know a lot of you, your elder status has meant that you've lost some of that hearing, and that is okay. So have I. The important thing for you to do is start listening with what you can hear better. There's actually technology out there that helps you hear some of those high frequency things, but with power tool use and various things, I can't hear above 8,000 hertz. But I can hear these other things, and they still advance what I'm able to know. The signs are literally everywhere. Okay? And what you realize as you start listening into your wild neighbors, whether it's in a city, a suburb, or in a wilderness, is that there's a community there. They rely on each other. They depend on each other. Yes, there's conflict, but there's a lot more cooperation than we really give them credit for. And believe it or not, it goes beyond one species. It's not just ravens or crows listening to other ravens and crows. It's, according to certain research, 50, 60, 70 bird species listening to the tufted titmouse or the squirrel. And we don't have in there are mammals, amphibians, reptiles. They are all listening to this enormous collective community conversation that the only ones who are left out of it in recent history has been us. You know, our ancestors used this to find food. They use this to put dinner on the table. They use this to navigate. They use this for so many purposes. We've just stepped out of it. So when the titmouse says, "Stop, there's something dangerous here," this whole community is listening across their own languages, if you will, and understand this collective language of alarm or ease and peace in a particular area. So when something happens, it's like a ring expands. You throw a pebble into a pond and the awareness spreads, and literally something will happen, whether that's you stepping out of your car to go for a hike with a friend. You close the car door, you are at the center of that ripple. And I never see animals when I go for a walk. It's because this ripple effect, they know you're coming long before you ever get there. In fact, if you put your watch to it, it's about 2 minutes. You can literally almost set a watch to it. If you're sitting out there and someone at the trailhead shows up, you've got 2 minutes to figure out what you're going to do to surprise them by the time they get there. It'll also allow you to find things that you may never see, that could be very close to you and around all the time. Around here, it could be a mountain lion. Your area, it's possible it could be a mountain lion too, but it might be that owl that someone saw down the street, but you haven't picked out. This community conversation will help you point it out. So I'm going to give you a case example here. I was out with some students a few winters ago, and we were looking for wolves. It was a wolf class. And we're looking, and I'm telling the students what I'm telling you. Look to the most common things, whatever you can see, and look to what it's doing. Look for changes in that. And as we're watching, we saw 2 black-billed magpies. They're a member of the crow family, like the raven is. And as they're flying along, like the one on the right, we just saw one of them bend its beak to the ground and then picked it up and kept flying. I said, "Did you see that?" Did you all see that? Half of the group didn't. Some did. And I said, "Look down below where it did that." And there's a wolf. It was uncollared, no radio collar, no way to track it. But it wasn't this obvious even. What it looked like, actually there were 2 of them, is like this. They looked like throw mats. They looked like rugs laying among the sagebrush, and they weren't even this visible. But that one simple act of the bird pointing its beak down, or the raven saying, "Ha!" directs our vision, our attention into some place that we never would have known to look. And of course, moments later, we discover the whole rest of the pack with a kill and all the attendants. So eagles and magpies and ravens and and all kinds of things. But about an hour into that, we hear another call. Coyotes actually have a very specific alarm call for wolves. Many species have very specific calls for threats that are in the air or on the ground. And any of us with almost any level of hearing can detect that difference. The coyote howl I did in the beginning, the dawn chorus, is what they do to announce their presence and keep others out of their turf. Right? Since about 2010, coyotes have been in every urban setting in North America. Okay? You may have seen them around home. But there's a call that they use that was not heard here until wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone. And it sounds like this. Lots of barking and that upswinging note. I don't even have to look. From 2 miles across the upper Yellowstone Valley, where our house is, I know there's a wolf out there. It only takes getting a pair of binoculars or a telescope, look, oh, yep, there it is. This is a little deeper in, a couple layers in, but there's still that effort to listen for patterns and when they change. And on this particular day, we didn't hear quite that alarm. We heard a barking sound from a coyote that sounded more like this. Hear that lower register in there, that kind of husky sound? It was different. I had only heard it a couple times, and I said to the group, this coyote is across the river in totally opposite direction as the wolves. We need to look where they're making this sound. And we looked, and sure enough, if you can see my cursor here, the wolves with a kill were here. We were standing on a hill here. The coyote was across the road and the river here, and it was looking into this drainage. It was going nuts. And not just for a second or two. This went on for 45 minutes. And I said to the class, I'm like, look, we have got to go look into this because this is unusual. There's something going on that we don't understand yet. And so we drove down there. We didn't see anything. We went and had breakfast. We came back. I said, let's do a loop. Let's walk that circle and see if we find any tracks in the snow because it was winter at that time. And lo and behold, not 30 feet off the road, we find this. A set of female mountain lion tracks that went up off the river ice, walked up into that drainage, past where the coyote was alarming in that unusual way, and then turned around and went right back down to the river. These big cats live in the more populated areas of Montana, the West, California, but they hunt at night. They're very cryptic. They don't want to be seen. And so unless you're using these kind of signals, you won't even ever know they're there. And it applies this in the same way to a bobcat. Or your cat gets out of the house. Want to know where your cat took off to? These same patterns of alarm, whether it might be, your local species, a vireo, a chickadee, is going to be signaling in the same sort of way. So this language of alarm is everywhere. But it's not just alarm. This is the easiest one for us to interact with oftentimes. And what is the most common alarm? You guessed it, silence. And I'll ask classes, how often have you as an individual gone somewhere in a developed or wild space and sat for 45 minutes to an hour and did nothing? No scrolling of devices, no listening to the radio, no talking on the phone, and just looked and listened. And what would you guess that answer is? Almost never. About 40 to 45 minutes is how long it takes an area that you've walked into to settle down and get back to its baseline, normal, calm, if you want to call it that. And so because we have never seen a landscape in anything but alarm, we don't know the signals that are out there. So this is where it bridges into some of your homework. It doesn't matter whether you're in an urban center. It might be in a suburban area. The patterns are the same. Here in Yellowstone, I see ravens in the air and they're circling one area. I see ravens in trees and they're looking down in another direction. I see birds on the ground. It might be crows in your area or pigeons. There's a reason, because the margins in nature are so tight, and it's a calorie economy, that they are not going to be wasting energy doing superfluous things. It could be in a neighborhood. That guy who just doesn't pick up his trash or leaves it out, way before the collectors come. Those birds will tell you things as specific as that. I had a student in Seattle. She was doing some gardening in the front yard, and her dogs were in the backyard. It's kind of a fenced area. And she remembered the version of this talk. She said there were crows in the trees going nuts, and they went on, and they wouldn't shut up. She said, finally, I remembered what you said. Just if there's something odd, something different, just go look and listen. She went into the backyard. The dogs were there, fine. Just on the safe side, she put them into the house. As she was coming back out of the house, she looked to the back wall. There's a retaining wall of the fenced backyard, and in a small gap above the retaining wall, she spotted a bobcat slip through that opening. That's what the crows were talking about. And from that point on, she could then track the direction and almost speed of travel for that bobcat throughout her neighborhood just outside of Seattle by what the crows said. It's something as simple as that. And this applies worldwide. A lot of Rotary projects. It's great to hear about the continued efforts to eradicate polio. These patterns that you learn in your own backyard apply everywhere you ever live or travel. So you go on that bucket list to Africa, like another friend of mine, and she had been just opening up to what was going on in her own backyard and the patterns that evolve with those animal conversations. And they're driving along and they're looking for wild dogs. And the guide is sitting on the bumper, like this image shows, and he's listening and looking. And from the back of the vehicle, she says, the dogs might be over that way. She points ahead and to the right. Over by those trees over there. And the guide looks and he says, they are. He turns around to her. How did you know that? She said, well, that's what the birds do in my backyard when the neighbor's dog comes through. She didn't know any of the species in Africa. She was wanting to see the wild dogs, but those same patterns are present there. They're present in Antarctica. They're present in Asia. They're present in Canada or Alaska, anywhere you travel. And it takes this notion of the web of life out of that textbook, antiseptic, distance sort of thing, and literally puts your fingers in contact with these elements. What does it mean when you mow the lawn? Something we probably don't even think about. Well, the cottontail rabbits might be at risk now of the neighborhood fox or your dog, because that cover has been blown. What is the utility of that dead tree that I'm planning to take down? Well, actually, that might be the center of the alarm station, if you will, the neighborhood watch for birds. Those tall and often dead trees are places they perch to look for danger. So you start to see your landscape that you share with these creatures as something more of a dynamic and fluid, integrated community. And where it really comes to the fore and is most precious is when you get to meet individuals from across the species divide. It is so touching to get to know that deer with a nick in her ear, or that squirrel with half a tail, or that bird with a white feather in its wing. They are some of your very best teachers because they take you into this world and show you that we share far more than separates us. They have desires, they have fears, they have wants, they mourn, if we want to call it that. We don't know exactly, but you see the signs that echo what we feel when a loved one is lost. So what is your homework as Rotaries? I want you to get outside more, because none of this matters anything if you don't have any exposure. So think about, what are the things that you can do? What are the things you do regularly throughout your day? And I want you to do them with a heightened sense of awareness. What are those things you can do outside? Have your cup of coffee outside on the porch this morning or tomorrow morning, or maybe for the next week, and watch what's going on. Look for these patterns. And perhaps out of there will grow a new idea of what this place means and that broader community of life that supports you and surrounds you, informs you, and inspires you as Rotaries and as citizens. So with that, I thank you. If you enjoyed this, I certainly recommend, I think we have a few copies of the book headed your way. but just recently published Eavesdropping on Animals with Greystone Books. And thank you so much for having me.
My question is, what came first, the ability to do the sound effects or the interest?
You know, I'll be honest with you. I grew up in a hunting and fishing community in New York, upstate New York. And it started with duck calling and calling, turkeys. And honestly, I knew there was more. I could tell from watching and interacting with these animals that there was much more to their lives that I did not know. It felt like there was this partition, this barrier that I couldn't penetrate. So I went through schooling in wildlife ecology. That really didn't touch on a lot of this stuff. And it wasn't until I just really started investing time in studying the birds when I was in graduate school, the animals around me, that this language, as a hunter, I'd learned that there was a sound when a unique sound that when a squirrel jumped through the undercover of a forest. It differed from that of a deer walking in the cadence of their steps, which was different than turkeys. But that was about as far as I got. Once I started listening more deeply in the ways we just discussed here, their world really opened up to me. I don't hunt anymore. I don't do a lot of those things. And I don't make those sounds outside. I quite often do them under my breath as a way to learn better the patterns. We all learn differently. Some of us need to see it. Some of us need to hear it. Some of us need to do it. And so by doing it, I do it under my breath, but it helps me see what I've been missing all along. As a hunter, as a fisherman, as a bird watcher, I miss a ton of stuff. So if you're bird watchers out there, a lot of folks will know those bird watchers focus really heavily on identifying the different species, but what a lot of them are just starting to catch on to is that a lot of times those calls that they identify and are using to find birds are actually alarm calls that the birds are making because of the birder. So it's been an amalgam. It started with making the sounds to attract them, but now it's evolved into a bit more.
So I can often hear somebody talking to me, but if there's a competing noise, I hear nothing. So my question is, for these ant species, you mentioned lawnmowers in terms of habitat, but noises like that, what happens to their communication? Are they likewise distracted when they hear lawnmowers or blowers or urban noises?
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that you will then have your own personal experience with. You hear about research saying that, the white-crowned sparrows in San Francisco have different dialects. And you can tell what part of the community you are in literally by what those sparrows say. But at the same time, and this was one of the things that your online program here evolved out of, was COVID. We couldn't have our own conversations. We weren't on the roads. We weren't in our communities in the same way. And for the wild species in their communities, it was a release. So you hear stories of these sparrows in San Francisco singing the tune that they used to sing, based on recordings that happened before life got so busy and as many cars and things on the roads. Tigers, leopards in India coming into the cities, wild boars coming back into the city of Rome. Like, these were things that came about because our activity and our sound was suppressed, and they flourished. So the short answer is absolutely yes. They sing louder and in different frequencies to overcome the effects of the airplane landing strip. And you will know that. You'll know that personally, and into what degree that changes them. Even your own stepping out of the door. What I really encourage people to do is not just step out the door and head to the car. Open the door slowly. Look through, if your door has a window, look out that window and see who's there first. Because usually they blast out of there. As soon as we open the door, they're gone. The birds take off. The rabbit goes onto the fence. We don't even know that they were there a lot of times. But as we slow down, they start to recognize our attention to them, and they give us wider berth. And you, with time, will be able to walk right by that rabbit. And your neighbor's like, what are you, some kind of St. Francis animal whisperer? No, it's a recognition of these others. and them recognizing in you your appreciation and awareness of them. And it changes the whole dynamic.
I just finished a book, Sing Like Fish. And who would have thought that there's that much communication
Right.
audibly between fish, and the interruptions in whale singing and how many variations there are of that, and the interference of ship noise and pile drivers and things like that on fish. So it was very interesting to see. I'd love to hear your impersonations of some of the fish songs.
Well, there was well, you'll get a kick out of this one. There was some research done on a certain type of fish acoustic signaling that was done through, well, they used the acronym FARTS, frequent and repetitive ticks. You can probably use your imagination and figure out how they were making this sound. But yeah, the ocean was thought to be silent for a long time, and not until actually it started with military, and back when the submarines and boats were starting to be monitored for military purposes, we realized, yeah, the ocean and so many other ecosystems are full of sound. Incredibly full of sound. And an acoustic ecologist from California by the name of Bernie Krause wrote a wonderful book called I believe it's Nature's Orchestra. And what he found was that every species is coming into that soundscape with its own bandwidth. Think of it like turning to a different radio station. Every species is coming into this mutual conversation going on simultaneously, picking its own bandwidth as to not interfere and interrupt with the other sounds going on. So they can be heard and they can hear. Who doesn't abide by those rules? It's what you alluded to. Mankind doesn't pay attention. So we cut across all the frequency spectra and drown everybody out. To the point in the oceans where some of the sounds, the detonations and things we're doing to conduct various tests are actually literally breaking the eardrums and ears of whales and other species like that. So they can't hear anymore either after those experiences. So thanks for the question.
My question is a scientific question. In medicine and science, we can do double-blind, placebo-controlled studies to prove cause and effect. What do you do besides observational studies, if anything, to try to determine what exactly are the animals trying to communicate when you hear them?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And it's a very important one because there's this dreaded term anthropomorphism. You know, we think we know what an animal's doing. We relate it to our own world, which there actually is a fair amount of overlap between our motives and that of the wild creatures around you, but they're not the same. So this is where science really has to be our fallback. I would also add to that indigenous awareness. A lot of these people still carry with them the culture of their people who are living directly with wild creatures for thousands of years and telling stories about their encounters. So those dual ways of ground truthing, if you will, what you're experiencing are crucial. In a more point-specific way here in Yellowstone, they've just kicked off a bioacoustics project that a friend of mine is intimately involved with, and we know biologists here in the park who have set up audio recorders in arrays all around Yellowstone. And they've just had the first full year of audio recordings completed. And this friend who used to work in tech built and trained an AI model to find all of the wolf howls. Keep in mind, it's recording everything. So we can go back in and write a model that finds all the coyote howls and try to reproduce or reconstruct, if you will, what the Crow or the Nez Perce people would have known about this landscape before their people disappeared. That period of thousands of years of interacting with these sounds in this place. So we're hoping that we can aggregate the thousands, and to date they've got a database of, I think Jeff was saying, over 4,000 wolf howls recorded. And when you overlay the observations on that, we can start checking, okay, is Bumann right? Does the coyote use that specific call when there's a cougar around? Do the wolves use that call when they're lost versus when they're together? Does it use that call? So it's critical that we check ourselves and ask these questions. And if you find something unique, ask your birder friends, ask the local natural history center. Hopefully someone in there is going to have a little bit of info to lead on further, and allow you to continue to check, because as all science shows us, a lot of things are point specific. They're fixed in time and space, and they change. So the bottom line is keep watching, but also keep studying. Thanks.
It's very interesting what you talked about wildlife, but I think most of us in this room have our own wildlife in our own homes with our dogs and cats. I have a hound, a cousin of the English foxhound, and when I'm gone, it can be an hour, 2 hours, or half a day or more, and I come and he's sitting at the front door, and he starts talking to me, and I talk back, and my wife says, I can't tell the difference between the two of you, but the question is, how do you figure out what they're saying, whether they're just happy to see me, or where have you been, or doing while you've been gone, and I go in and the house is torn up. I don't know. Do you have any way of figuring out your language? Because he also, if I take him for a ride, he doesn't stop for the first 15 minutes howling. He doesn't bark, he howls.
Yeah, and I think all of the beautiful question, wonderful question, because I think you're exactly right. So many of us have wild creatures living right alongside us, and we have friends who she could know from the other side of the house whether there was a fly in the window because of this kind of weird cat sound that her cat would make. She only made it for flies. Why? Who knows? Did she have a weird experience with flies? Don't ask me. A lot of you probably know when a neighbor's coming over versus a family member versus the FedEx guy, right? The dog has a different bark or yip. The best answer I can give to that question of how do you figure out more of those details is change the equation. So come home later, come home with someone else. Set up your own experiments and see, does the dog howl for the first 15 minutes because you're driving the same road that goes to the place you go play fetch or go for a walk or where he's allowed to run off the leash, right? Drive the other direction in town, or, these sorts of things to just start parsing out. Okay, it's only happening in this place. What we discovered with the wolf howl recordings already is that we thought wolves howled at dawn and dusk most. It turns out, largely because no one sat out there like one of these autonomous recorders all night long for an entire year, is that they howl 24 hours a day, but the vast majority of it is during the dark hours. Once it's dark, they just howl and howl and howl. That's not toward the moon, So sometimes even these situational or timing things can help you start picking apart and then start manipulating them. In nature, it's super tough. You just have to observe long enough until the variation comes through. But you, with your dog and your cats and your birds, we have a friend who had a lorikeet. She lived in Mammoth Hot Springs in Yellowstone. She knew exactly when a coyote was coming through the neighborhood because this lorikeet had one call that it only used when the coyotes came through. Not a dog, not even dogs that look like coyotes. She knew when a coyote came through, and the bird was never wrong. Crazy. Thanks. Next question.
Well, I want to let you know a couple of things. Main one is we have a dog here with us today. One of our members brings her dog in the morning, and when you were doing your calls, the dog was going, huh? Huh? So you had at least one person, one creature in the room that was entranced. It's not a question of one, something to. You kindled a memory in me. We talking about animals and interacting with humans and how we're more often than not oblivious. I was up in, my wife and I were up in Tuolumne Meadows in Yosemite at a ranger talk. And the ranger asked, how many of you have seen a mountain lion? No hands went up. Then he asked, how many of you have been seen by an animal? And then he told us, all of your hands should be up. He said, I'll guarantee you, if you've been here for more than 2 hours, you have come close to a mountain lion and not known it. But so thank you. This was a marvelous talk.
Thank you so much. And thanks for that, because it's so true. They know we're coming through those ripple effects, and they have a choice. Some animals just take off. We had a grizzly bear study here where they sent people out with GPS units, and they had bears with collars that had GPS units. And as soon as people started hiking the trails in these remote areas of the park, the bears took off. And nobody saw the bears. But the bears were responding to humans. One bear took off and ran 11 miles in just over an hour from an interaction with a human that the human never even knew of. That's happening all the time. Other animals, like that mountain lion, they take the other choice. They say, I'm going to hide and hope you walk right by. And that happens so frequently. You've probably all seen on social media or the internet, the family photo, and someone discovers the mountain lion hidden in the grass right there. I've seen about 30 mountain lions in the wild, but I know I've been seen by way more. And that speaks to the fact that each one of us is being seen, listened to, but also evaluated. We're being seen as other animals see each other, not as a species, as an individual. So if you feed the birds, they like you. They know you apart from the neighbor who just comes over to drop off eggs from his chickens but doesn't do anything to the birds. They all recognize us as individuals and they react differently. That is fascinating to me. Sorry, next question.
Again, thank you. Yeah, I think you open up a whole new dimension when we walk outside now, for at least for me, and I hope for everyone else. There's an owl goes nuts every night near our house. It's the most predominant noise in the evening. And I just say, it's okay, it's time to go to sleep because the hoot owl's out there. And I guess 6 nights in a row is supposed to be a bad luck, bad omen or something, but we have that. And just for everyone, speaking of aquatic mammal noises, we're going to have someone here soon that has used AI to decipher whale songs to see what they're actually saying. So get excited about that. And also think of Everglades National Park. You can walk up to the gators. They don't do anything. The buzzards will sit right near your shoulder. They just come right up. I'd love to hear your opinion of that. But I want to ask is, what do you think the owls are hooting about all night outside our window here in California? And thank you again. This is wonderful.
Thank you for saying. I appreciate that. And what is the most conversation of any creature probably fall into? Sex, right? Those great horned owls, they've started hooting more around us as well. It quite often is that. It's not always that, but depending on the time of the year, pay attention to when that sound really picks up. And interesting thing about great horned owls and a lot of species is they are tailored to their environment intimately. So your great horns are going to be hooting starting at a different time than ours do, because the conditions at which they're most successful at rearing chicks and that whole timeline of when the best food is available is backdated to when the most successful breeding and egg laying happens. So you're going to see that flurry of hooting most often around courtship period. It's after dark, of course, because they're nocturnal birds, but that's also backdated against the time at which the birds who lay the eggs that produce the chicks during the periods that are most successful at producing successful chicks have survived. So they become locally adapted to that place. And wouldn't you like to see that owl during the day? Like, where the heck does it hide? You only know it's there because it hoots at night. But if you pay attention to the chickadees or the smaller birds, when you see a ball of them all carrying on excessively in one place, in, say, an evergreen tree. I just got a text yesterday. A friend saw his first saw-whet owl. It's a much smaller than a great horned owl, little tiny guy. First one ever, and he's a wildlife guide. He's one tuned into wildlife. But with some of the things I told him, he didn't walk past those chattering birds. He slowed down He was walking the dog. And this, you don't have to go out and sit for an hour. Use the times you have every single day. I walk from the car to work, or to the car over to a friend's house. That 30 seconds, listen into the airspace around you in that 30 seconds. You take the trash out. Don't do it with the iPad or the iPhone or whatever you have running. Listen, and you're going to start finding new things in that space that will really expand your understanding and awareness, sometimes miles from that one point you stand. So, yeah, keep listening to those owls, listening to where it ebbs, and then start looking. Look it up online. There's plenty of resources out there. They should start hatching at this date. They should start fledging at this date. And then you'll hear a pickup in the hooting sounds or the begging calls of the chicks, and you can find the nest. So beautiful. But understand, too, as you now become a steward of that owl, you don't tell everybody where that owl nest is. Why? Because that is a sacred, safe place for that bird. And if you destroy that by way of bringing the whole neighborhood over to look straight at them with binoculars, it's no longer that. This process of listening to that broader community embeds within us a different sort of empathy, an empathy that spans and reaches past the species boundary. You want to see that owl successful now. You want to see that deer bring off both of her fawns, not just one or none. So, yeah.